He had always believed that land had a memory. Not in a magical way, but in a quiet, human way. Paths stayed where people walked the most. Trees leaned where the wind had pushed them for years. Water followed rules older than any fence or paper map. That belief stayed with him as he stood near the edge of the property one late afternoon. Boots pressed into soft earth, watching the sun dip behind a low hill. The land was not flashy. No perfect lawns. No bright lights. Just long stretches of grass, a slow-moving creek, and a modest dam built decades ago. The dam was not huge or dramatic. It did one simple job. It controlled the water, so the lower land never flooded. It had been there longer than most of the nearby houses, longer than the roads that now cut through the area. The land had come to him after a loss. A relative had owned it for most of their life, keeping it quiet and mostly untouched. When the papers were signed and the keys were handed over, he felt more responsibility than excitement. This was not something to sell quickly or change overnight. It was something to protect. At first, nothing felt wrong. He visited on weekends, sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend who liked fishing. He checked the dam gates like he had been taught, walked the boundaries, and kept copies of old maps folded carefully in a weathered folder. The maps showed lines that mattered. Even if no one else seemed to look at them anymore, then the sound started. At first it was distant, a low hum that could be mistaken for traffic. Then came the beeping of heavy machines and the grinding sound of earth being moved. One Saturday morning, he parked near the usual spot and noticed tire tracks that had not been there before. They cut across grass that had always been left alone. He followed the tracks slowly. Each step made his chest feel tighter. Ahead, bright flags marked the ground, and beyond them stood machines resting like animals between jobs. Construction had arrived. He did not panic. Growth was common in that area. New houses had been moving closer every year. Still, something felt off. The machines were not just nearby, they were close. Too close. He pulled out the folded maps and checked the lines again. The markers on the ground did not match what he held in his hands. According to the records, this section of land was his. Clear and simple. The next week, more machines arrived. Workers moved quickly, focused on their tasks, not on questions from a man standing at the edge of a field. He asked one worker who was in charge. The worker pointed toward a temporary office trailer and said the work was approved and managed by the local homeowners association connected to a new housing project. That name stayed with him. Homeowners Association. He had heard enough stories to know that dealing with one was never simple. Still, he believed in calm conversation. He believed that most problems came from mistakes, not bad intentions. So he called the number listed on the trailer and asked for a meeting. The meeting was short. He sat across from two representatives who smiled politely but barely listened. He showed them the maps. He explained the dam, the water flow, and the history of the land. He spoke slowly, clearly, without anger. They nodded, took notes, and then told him the development plans had already been approved. According to their records, the land was part of a long-term expansion. Any disagreement, they said, could be handled later through official channels. Construction would continue. He left that meeting feeling unsettled. Not angry yet. Just uneasy. He sent follow-up emails. He mailed copies of documents. He contacted the county office to confirm boundaries. Every response took time. Every answer came slowly. Meanwhile, the land changed quickly. Wood frames rose where grass once grew. Roads were leveled. Drainage pipes were placed without much thought to the creek or the dam upstream. He watched from a distance. Knowing that stepping too close would only create conflict, he kept records of everything. Dates, photos, copies of letters. He had learned long ago that memory alone was not enough when problems grew larger than a single conversation. As weeks passed, he noticed something else. The natural flow of water was being altered. Dirt piles blocked small channels that had guided rainwater safely for years. The land, which had always handled storms without trouble, now looked strained. He tried again to warn them. He explained that the dam was not decorative. It was part of a system. Blocking natural paths could cause water to build up in places it never had before. The response was always the same. The plans were approved. The engineers had handled it. Everything was under control, but standing on the land, listening to water move where it never used to, he knew that control was only an illusion. One evening, as the sun set and shadows stretched across the half-built homes, he walked along the dam and placed his hand on the cool concrete. It felt solid, steady, unchanged. The dam did not care about new houses or paperwork. It only followed physics and gravity. He wondered if the people building nearby understood that. He wondered if anyone ever truly listened when someone said, quietly and without threat, that a line had been crossed. That night, he went home and laid the maps out across the table again. The lines were still there, clear as ever. The land had not moved. The dam had not changed. Only people had. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The weeks after that first realization did not slow down. If anything, everything moved faster than before. The sound of machines became part of the background, like wind or distant traffic. Each visit to the land brought a new change. Another section cleared, another outline of a house rising where open ground had once been. He tried to tell himself that problems like this had solutions. Paperwork existed for a reason. Laws existed for a reason. Mistakes happened, and when they were pointed out, reasonable people corrected them. That belief helped him sleep at night, at least at first. He began by gathering everything. Old deeds, updated surveys, water permits, maintenance records for the dam, letters written long before anyone talked about building dozens of homes nearby. He organized them carefully, labeling folders, making copies, and backing them up digitally. It felt strange to prepare this way, like preparing for a storm that had not yet arrived, but could already be seen on the horizon. He returned to the Homeowners Association office with calm determination. This time, he did not just bring maps. He brought proof. He laid everything out on the table, page by page, explaining slowly where the boundary lines were and why the construction had crossed them. He explained how the dam worked, how water was released in controlled amounts, and how blocking natural channels would cause pressure to build. The people across from him listened, but their eyes drifted. One checked a phone, another tapped a pen against the desk. When he finished, there was a pause that felt heavy. They told him the development plans had gone through multiple approvals. They said engineers had signed off on drainage. They said delays would be costly. They said these kinds of disagreements were common and usually resolved later. They suggested he speak to their legal department if he wanted to take it further. The message was clear, even if it was not spoken out loud. Construction would not stop. He left the office with the same tight feeling in his chest, but now it was mixed with frustration. He was not asking for favors. He was asking them to respect what was legally his. Still, the machines kept moving. Soon, signs appeared welcoming future residents. Streets were named. Curbs were painted. What had been a quiet stretch of land was now turning into a planned neighborhood. One that did not acknowledge the dam or the water that made the land livable in the first place. He began documenting more carefully. He took photos after every heavy rain. He filmed short clips showing how water pooled where it never had before. He noted how dirt piles redirected runoff straight toward low-lying areas. None of this felt dramatic on its own, but together it painted a picture he could not ignore. He reached out to the county office again, requesting an updated inspection. The response came weeks later, polite but slow. There were backlogs, staffing issues, scheduling delays. In the meantime, construction continued without pause. At home, he spent evenings reading about similar situations: land disputes, water rights, environmental impact reports that had been ignored until it was too late. The stories were unsettling, not because they were extreme, but because they were familiar. Too familiar. What troubled him most was how easily concerns were brushed aside. When he talked about water flow, people heard inconvenience. When he talked about risk, they heard delay. No one seemed to understand that water did not negotiate. As summer turned toward storm season, the air grew heavier. Clouds lingered longer. The creek ran higher after even modest rain. He walked the dam more often, checking for debris, clearing small branches, making sure the gates moved smoothly. The structure itself was solid, maintained carefully over the years. It was not the weak point. The weak point was everything downstream. One afternoon, he noticed a new fence line had been installed. It cut across a section of land he knew well, land that sloped gently toward the creek. The fence redirected foot traffic, and more importantly, altered how water spread during rainfall. It was a small change, but small changes added up. He contacted the homeowners association again, this time in writing. He outlined specific concerns. He included photos and dates. He asked for a temporary pause in construction near the dam until an independent review could be completed. The reply came days later, short, formal, unhelpful. The plans were approved. There was no reason to pause. Any further concerns could be addressed after completion. After completion, those words stayed with him. After the land was changed beyond recognition, after the water had nowhere to go, after damage could no longer be undone, friends told him to push harder. Some told him to take them to court immediately. Others said he should accept a settlement before things got worse. Everyone had an opinion, but no one else stood on that land feeling the ground soften under their feet. He spoke with a lawyer, careful and measured. The lawyer listened and nodded, flipping through documents. The advice was realistic but discouraging. Legal action would take time, months at best, possibly longer. In the meantime, construction would likely continue unless a judge ordered otherwise. Time was the one thing he felt he did not have. Storm warnings began appearing on the local news. Nothing severe yet, but enough to raise concern. He watched the sky more closely now, noting how quickly clouds built in the afternoons. He checked weather reports before driving out to the land, sometimes arriving just as rain began to fall. During one visit after a heavy rain, he saw it clearly for the first time. Water had pooled behind a newly built road, pressing against soil that had not been reinforced properly. The creek downstream ran muddy and fast, carrying debris that should never have reached it. He stood there longer than he should have, watching the water push against the land, searching for the paths it used to know. Later that evening, he wrote another letter. This one was firmer, but still respectful. He explained that continued construction without addressing drainage concerns could lead to serious problems. He stated clearly that the dam was privately owned and maintained, and that its operation was not subject to HOA control. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated facts. The response came from a different department this time. It suggested that the homeowners association believed the dam served the community and therefore fell under shared interest. It implied, without outright saying it, that they expected cooperation. That assumption bothered him deeply. The dam was not built for convenience. It was built for safety. It was maintained through years of quiet work, inspections, and repairs paid for privately. Treating it as a shared asset without shared responsibility felt wrong. As more houses were completed, he noticed new residents visiting the area, pointing at lots, imagining futures. Children ran near construction zones. People trusted that what was being built was safe. That trust weighed heavily on him. He did not want conflict. He did not want anyone harmed. He wanted the builders to slow down and listen before something went wrong. But every attempt to communicate seemed to disappear into a system designed to move forward. A pause. The pressure increased subtly. Phone calls suggesting compromise. Conversations hinting at buyouts. Offers that sounded generous, until he compared them to the true value of the land and the responsibility tied to it. He declined politely. At night, he lay awake thinking about the dam, the water, and the houses sitting in places that had never been tested by real storms. He imagined heavy rain falling for days, the ground giving way, and people asking questions only after the damage was done. He knew he could not control the weather, but he could control what he owned. One evening, standing near the dam as the sky darkened, he made a quiet decision. It was not driven by anger or revenge. It was driven by responsibility. The dam needed inspection. Maintenance was overdue according to the schedule he had inherited. Any responsible owner would ensure everything was functioning properly before storm season. That decision brought a strange sense of calm. He documented his plans carefully. He notified the appropriate offices of scheduled maintenance. He kept copies of every notice. He did everything by the book, knowing that clarity mattered now more than ever. As he locked the gate and walked away that night, rain began to fall softly. It tapped against leaves and stone, following gravity as it always had. He did not know what the coming weeks would bring. He only knew that lines had been ignored for too long, and that pretending everything was fine would help no one. The water would eventually remind everyone of that truth by the time the first real storms arrived. The situation no longer felt like a disagreement. It felt like a waiting game, one where everyone involved was pretending not to hear the ticking clock in the background. The clouds rolled in heavy and slow, darker than usual, and the air carried that thick, uneasy feeling that always came before long rain. He noticed the change immediately. The creek rose faster than it ever had before, even with moderate rain. Water that once spread out gently across the land now rushed through narrow paths forced on it by new roads, packed soil and concrete edges. The land was trying to behave the way it always had, but it was being pushed into shapes that did not suit it. He kept returning to the same thought. None of this was sudden. None of it was unexpected. Every sign had been there for anyone willing to slow down and look. But slowing down was not part of the plan. He spent more time alone now. Less conversation. Fewer explanations. He had learned that repeating himself changed nothing. Instead, he focused on preparation. He walked the dam carefully, inspecting bolts, checking seals, making sure nothing had shifted. He cleared debris from the spillway and marked water levels after each rainfall. The dam responded the way it always had, calm, predictable, honest. Water came in. Water went out. No drama. No shortcuts. Downstream, things were different. One afternoon, after a long rain, he stood at the edge of the property and watched water collect behind a newly built retaining wall. It pressed against it slowly, silently, like a question waiting for an answer. He could see where soil had already begun to soften. It was not a failure yet, but it was close enough to make his stomach tighten. He took photos, then videos. He sent them to the same contacts he had written to before. The messages were polite but firm. This was not theoretical anymore. This was happening. The replies came late, if at all. Some were vague acknowledgments. Others suggested the issue would be reviewed after the current phase of construction, after he stopped expecting help at night. He replayed conversations in his head. Not arguments, just moments where things could have gone differently if someone had listened. He wondered how many decisions were being made in rooms far away by people who had never stepped onto the land, never felt the ground give slightly underfoot, never heard water shift direction when it was blocked. The legal process moved slowly, exactly as he had been warned. Forms were filed. Dates were suggested and then pushed back. Each delay felt heavier than the last. The law worked on its own time, but the weather did not. As more houses were finished, more people appeared. Cars lined the streets on weekends as future residents walked through open homes. Children played near unfinished sidewalks. People laughed and imagined where furniture would go. They trusted that someone, somewhere, had made sure everything was safe. That trust weighed on him more than any letter or threat ever could. He began to feel responsible not just for his land, but for the consequences of what was happening to it. Not because he caused the problem, but because he saw it clearly. Knowing something and doing nothing felt wrong. He met with an independent inspector on his own time and at his own cost. They walked the land together in silence at first. Then the inspector asked careful questions about water flow, about historical patterns, about changes made during construction. When they reached the dam, the inspector nodded slowly. There was no alarm in the reaction, but there was concern. The report that followed was detailed and cautious. It did not accuse anyone directly, but it outlined risks, clear ones. Risks that grew larger the longer nothing changed. He shared the report. He attached it to emails. He referenced it in letters. He did not exaggerate. He did not soften it either. The response from the Homeowners Association shifted slightly in tone. Still firm, but more careful now. They acknowledged the concerns but questioned the scope. They suggested adjustments could be made later if necessary. They emphasized that the dam should continue operating as it always had. That last part stood out to him. Operating as it always had meant controlling water responsibly. It did not mean compensating for poor planning downstream. It did not mean taking on new risks created by others. Another storm arrived, heavier than the last. Rain fell for hours without pause. He stood under shelter near the dam, watching water levels rise steadily. The system worked, but pressure built behind the scenes, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. Down below, he could already see areas where water had nowhere to go. Streets glistened. Yards turned soft. Temporary barriers were placed hastily, more for appearance than function. The next morning, emergency vehicles passed through the area, responding to minor flooding complaints. Nothing catastrophic. Yet news traveled fast. People talked. Rumors spread. Some blamed the weather. Others blamed poor drainage. Few understood how closely everything was connected. He stayed quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had already said it all. Pressure came in quieter ways now. Conversations that hinted at shared responsibility. Suggestions that the dam be managed differently for the benefit of the community. Requests framed as cooperation rather than control. He listened, then declined. The dam was not a bargaining chip. It was infrastructure, maintained with care, governed by rules that existed long before new streets had names. Another meeting was scheduled. This one included more people. More serious expressions. More talk of compromise. He brought his documents again. Though he doubted they would change anything, he explained once more that altering the dam's operation without addressing downstream design would only hide the problem temporarily. Water would always find its level. It always did. The meeting ended without resolution. Driving home that evening, rain streaked across his windshield. The road dipped slightly near the edge of the development, and water pooled there longer than it used to. It was a small thing, easy to ignore. But he did not ignore it. He thought about responsibility again. About what it meant to own land. Not just to claim it, but to understand it. Back at home, he reviewed maintenance schedules. He checked inspection guidelines. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The dam required a temporary adjustment and inspection before heavier storms arrived. That was standard practice. Responsible practice. He prepared the notices carefully, sent them to the appropriate offices, filed them where required. He followed procedure step by step. There was no dramatic announcement, no confrontation, just paperwork and quiet resolve. As the days passed, the sky stayed dark. Rain came and went. The land responded as best it could. People began to notice changes. Conversations grew tense. Questions were asked. He stayed steady. This was not about proving a point. It was about preventing something worse, standing once more by the dam as water moved steadily through the system. He felt a strange mix of calm and concern. Calm because he was doing what was right. Concern because he knew others would not see it that way. The situation had reached a point where ignoring reality was no longer an option. Something would have to give, and soon. Everyone would understand why water was never something to take lightly. The rain did not arrive all at once. It came in slow waves, the kind that feel harmless at first and then refuse to leave. Gray clouds sat low over the land for days, barely moving, as if they had settled in and decided to stay. The air felt heavy, and the ground no longer dried between showers. Everything absorbed water, quietly and steadily. He noticed the change in sound before anything else. Rain no longer tapped lightly on leaves. It pressed down, constant and dull, filling every small space it could find. The creek widened, not dramatically, but enough to change its rhythm. Where water once slipped past stones, it now pushed against them. He followed his routine carefully. Every visit to the dam was documented. Every adjustment was noted. He checked gates, measured levels, and cleared debris, as he always had. Nothing about his actions was rushed or careless. This was normal maintenance, done at the right time, for the right reasons. The difference now was everything downstream. The new roads and houses had changed, how the land breathed. Water that used to spread slowly across open ground was being pushed into tighter channels. It moved faster, with more force, carrying soil and debris along with it. The land was trying to adjust, but it was being asked to do too much too quickly. He could see it clearly. In places where grass once slowed runoff, bare soil now let water slide freely. Temporary barriers placed during construction had become unintended dams of their own, trapping water where it did not belong. The design assumed dry conditions, not days of steady rain. He sent one final notice to the appropriate offices. It was short and factual. Maintenance was underway. Water levels would be managed according to established guidelines. He attached copies of permits and schedules. He did not accuse. He did not warn. He simply informed. The response did not come right away. Instead, messages began arriving from other directions. Questions framed as concern. Requests framed as cooperation. Suggestions that small adjustments could help everyone. He read them all carefully and replied with the same calm clarity he had. Maintained from the beginning, the dam would be operated safely and legally. It would not be used to compensate for design choices made elsewhere. That night, rain intensified. It fell harder, louder, and without pause. He stayed near the land longer than usual, watching water levels rise steadily. The system responded exactly as it was designed to. Nothing failed. Nothing broke down below, however. The effects were becoming harder to ignore. Water began to collect along streets that had never flooded before. Not deep enough to cause panic, but enough to worry people who were not used to seeing it. Yards turned into shallow pools. Driveways held water longer than expected. Emergency crews arrived to direct traffic in a few low areas. They moved cones, cleared drains, and reassured residents that the situation was being monitored. It was calm on the surface, but tense underneath. He watched from a distance, not out of fear, but out of respect. This was no longer just about landlines or documents. Real people were now affected by decisions made without proper care. The rain continued into the next day. Calls came more frequently now. Some were polite. Some were strained. He answered when necessary and repeated the same facts. The dam was under inspection. Operations were normal. Any changes would be communicated through proper channels. He did not argue. He did not explain beyond what was required. Everything he said could be supported by records. As the storm persisted, investigators from the county arrived to assess drainage issues. They walked the streets, took notes, and asked questions. He spoke with them briefly. Providing copies of permits and maintenance logs when requested, they listened carefully. One inspector asked a simple question that stood out from the rest. How had the land handled storms like this before construction began? The answer was simple. It handled them quietly. That answer seemed to matter. By the third day of rain, the situation had shifted from concern to scrutiny. Temporary fixes were no longer enough. Water was exposing weaknesses that had been easy to overlook in dry weather. The Homeowners Association issued statements, emphasizing cooperation and shared responsibility. They acknowledged unexpected weather patterns and assured residents that solutions were being explored. He read the statements without emotion. Weather patterns were not the problem. Planning was. Late that afternoon, the rain finally eased. Clouds began to break apart, and pale light returned to the land. Water levels stabilized. The immediate pressure passed, leaving behind wet ground and unanswered questions. He walked the dam one more time before leaving. Everything was intact. Everything had done its job. Downstream, the land told a different story. In the days that followed, inspections multiplied. Engineers reviewed plans. Surveyors rechecked boundaries. Reports were written and rewritten. Conversations that had once been dismissive became careful. He was asked to attend meetings again, this time with more attention and fewer assumptions. He brought the same documents he always had, the same maps, the same records. This time, people listened. Questions were asked about why natural drainage paths had been altered, about why construction continued despite documented concerns, about how water rights and land ownership had been verified. Answers were slower now. The focus shifted subtly but clearly. It was no longer about whether a mistake had been made, but about how large that mistake might be. Residents began asking their own questions. Not loudly, not angrily, but with growing concern. They wanted to know why water had reached places it never had before, why assurances given during purchase did not match reality. He did not speak to them directly. It was not his place. He understood their frustration, but he also knew that anger without facts would only make things worse. Instead, he continued to cooperate fully with official reviews. He provided access to the dam for inspection. He shared historical data showing water levels over time. He answered questions honestly and without blame. The truth did not need decoration. As more information came to light, it became clear that the dam had been misunderstood. It was not a shared feature. It was not designed to support expanded development without changes elsewhere. It had limits, clearly defined, clearly documented. Those limits had been ignored. One evening, after a long day of meetings, he returned to the land alone. The ground was still soft, and the air smelled clean after the rain. Birds had returned cautiously, as they always did. He stood near the water and thought about how easily this could have gone wrong in a much worse way. A few more days of rain, a little more pressure. The outcome could have been very different. The thought unsettled him, but it also reinforced why he had acted the way he did, why he had stayed calm when others pushed, why he had relied on facts instead of fear. The following week, construction slowed noticeably. Some work stopped entirely. Equipment sat idle. Temporary fencing was moved again, this time to reopen blocked drainage paths. Official notices were posted. Reviews were ongoing. Adjustments were required. No one admitted fault outright. That would come later, if at all. But the shift was clear. He continued his maintenance routine as always, now with more eyes watching. Inspectors visited the dam regularly. Each visit confirmed the same conclusion. The structure was sound. Its operation was appropriate. The problem lay elsewhere as the process unfolded. He noticed something unexpected within himself. Relief, yes, but also sadness. This conflict had never needed to happen. It had grown out of rushed decisions and ignored warnings. He wondered how many similar situations existed elsewhere, unseen until water or time forced them into view. One afternoon, a letter arrived summarizing preliminary findings. It was formal and careful in its language, but the message was clear. Boundary lines had not been respected. Environmental considerations had been insufficient. Further action would be required. He set the letter down and looked out the window at the quiet land beyond. The creek flowed calmly again, following paths it recognized. The dam held steady, doing its simple job. The storm had passed, but its impact remained. What came next would not be decided by rain or water alone. It would be decided by how willing people were to accept responsibility. He knew his role now. It was the same role he had taken from the beginning. To protect what he owned, to act responsibly, and to let facts speak louder than pressure. As evening settled over the land once more, he felt a sense of closure beginning to form. Not an ending, but a turning point. The dam had not been opened in anger. It had been managed with care, and in doing so, it had revealed truths that could no longer be ignored. The days after the inspections felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, but careful. The kind of quiet that comes when people realize they are being watched more closely than before. The land itself seemed to relax as well. The creek settled back into its familiar path. and the ground slowly firmed as the last of the stormwater drained away. He noticed fewer machines running each morning. Some sat unused for days, their bright paint dulled by dried mud. Workers moved more slowly now, often stopping to talk instead of rushing from task to task. The energy had changed. Confidence had been replaced with caution. Official notices continued to appear around the development. They were written in careful language, avoiding blame, but their meaning was clear enough. Reviews were ongoing. Certain sections were under evaluation. Adjustments were required before any further progress. He kept his distance, just as he always had. He did not walk through the neighborhood or speak to residents directly. He understood their frustration and worry, but he also knew that his role was not to argue in public or assign fault. His responsibility was to stay steady and let the process unfold. Requests for information continued to arrive. Surveyors asked for access points. Engineers asked about historical water levels. Inspectors asked about maintenance schedules and permits. He answered every request fully and on time. There was nothing to hide. As reports were finalized, a clear picture began to emerge. Boundary lines had been misunderstood or ignored during planning. Natural drainage paths had been altered without proper consideration. Assumptions had been made about shared infrastructure that did not match legal reality. None of this surprised him. What did surprise him was how quickly. Attitudes changed once facts became unavoidable. Conversations that once felt dismissive now carried respect. Questions were more thoughtful. Listening replaced interruption. One afternoon, he was invited to attend a meeting with representatives from several departments. It was not confrontational. There were no raised voices. Just a long table, stacks of documents, and a shared understanding that mistakes had consequences. He spoke plainly. He explained again that his actions had never been about stopping development or causing trouble. They had been about protecting land, water, and people from avoidable harm. No one argued with that. Over the following weeks, decisions were made. Some homes were flagged for modification. Drainage systems were redesigned. Certain sections of land were declared non-compliant with original approvals. Construction timelines were revised. The Homeowners Association released statements acknowledging errors in planning and oversight. The language was measured, but the shift was significant. Responsibility was finally being addressed. For residents, the news brought mixed emotions. Relief that issues were being corrected. Frustration at delays. Worry about property values and future repairs. He felt all of it too. In a quieter way. He understood that while he had been cleared of responsibility, the situation had still affected real people. Families who had trusted promises. Children who had played in yards that now required drainage work. None of that was lost on him. He continued maintaining the dam as he always had. Inspections confirmed what he already knew. The structure was sound. Its operation had been appropriate throughout the storms. Official letters arrived confirming this in writing. Clear statements that responsibility for downstream flooding did not rest with him. That his actions had been lawful, documented, necessary. He filed those letters carefully. Legal proceedings followed, though he was not directly involved beyond providing information. Disputes over land use and approvals moved through proper channels now, where they belonged. Construction eventually resumed in limited areas, but with new rules in place. Drainage paths were restored where possible. Open ground was preserved instead of covered. The land was given space to function as it needed to. He watched these changes from a distance, feeling neither victory nor satisfaction, only relief that disaster had been avoided. One evening, as the sun set over the land, he walked along the creek and listened to water moving gently over stone. The sound was familiar again, comforting. He thought back to the first time. He had noticed those tire tracks cutting across grass. How small the problem had seemed then. How easy it would have been to ignore it. Ignoring it would have been simpler, but simplicity was not the same as responsibility. The experience changed him in subtle ways. He became more patient, but also more certain. More aware that standing firm did not require anger or loud words. It required consistency and care. Months later, the land looked different, but not broken. Houses stood where open ground once had, but they were built with greater respect for the natural systems around them. Water flowed where it was meant to flow. The dam remained what it had always been, quiet, reliable, unnoticed by most. He preferred it that way, occasionally. He received messages from people who had learned about the situation through local news or community meetings. Some thanked him for speaking up. Others simply asked questions, trying to understand how something like this could happen. He answered when he could, always with the same message. Pay attention to the land. Ask questions early. Do not assume that approvals mean perfection. The story did not end with celebration or apology. Real life rarely does. It ended with adjustments, lessons, and a return to balance. Standing near the dam one last time before leaving for the season, he rested his hand on the cool concrete and looked out across the land. The water moved steadily. Following rules that never changed, people he knew would keep making mistakes. But as long as someone was willing to listen to the land itself, there was always a chance to fix them before it was too late. He turned and walked away. The sound of flowing water behind him, steady and calm, carrying the quiet reminder that boundaries matter, and so does the courage to protect them. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges. What once felt urgent slowly becomes memory, and memory settles into something easier to carry. In the months that followed the final decisions, life around the land moved into a quieter rhythm. The headlines faded. Meetings stopped. Trucks no longer arrived early in the morning. The sound of construction, once constant, disappeared almost completely. He noticed the silence first. It was not sudden. It came in pieces. One morning there were fewer workers. Another day, none at all. The temporary offices were removed, and the signs promising future phases were taken down. Grass began to grow again in places where soil had been left bare for too long. Nature, patient as always, started reclaiming space without asking permission. He continued visiting the land regularly, though his visits felt different now. There was no urgency in his steps, no tightness in his chest. He walked slowly, stopping often, listening to sounds he had missed during the months of stress. Birds returned in greater numbers. Insects buzzed through tall grass. The creek reflected the sky clearly again. The dam remained unchanged, solid, reliable. It had never been the problem, and it never needed recognition. It simply did what it was built to do. People from nearby homes occasionally waved when they saw him. Some recognized him. Others did not. A few approached him carefully, unsure of how to begin. Their questions were never angry. Mostly they were curious. They wanted to know how something like that could happen. How planning could fail so badly. How warnings could be ignored. He answered honestly, without blame. He told them that systems often move too fast, that people trust paperwork more than land. That responsibility gets passed around until no one feels it anymore. Some listened quietly. Others nodded, thoughtful. A few thanked him. Those moments stayed with him more than any official letter ever had. Life, outside, the land continued as well. He returned to routines that had been interrupted. Workdays felt normal again. Evenings were calmer. He slept better. Yet something had changed inside him. He paid more attention now. Not just to land and water, but to small details in everyday life. He noticed when rules were followed blindly instead of thoughtfully, when speed was valued more than care, when quiet warnings were brushed aside. The experience had not made him bitter. It had made him aware. One afternoon, he received a letter marked Final. It summarized outcomes that had already become clear through action. Adjustments completed. Boundaries reaffirmed. Responsibilities clarified. He read it once, then placed it in a folder with the others. It did not feel like a victory letter. It felt like a record, something that might matter again someday. The land itself showed signs of recovery. Drainage paths were open again. Water spread naturally during rain instead of rushing. The creek no longer carried excess debris. On one visit after a heavy rainfall, he stood near the dam and watched the system work smoothly. Water moved through exactly as it should have. No buildup. No strain. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not pride, just relief. As seasons passed, the development settled into its new reality. Homes were lived in. Yards were planted. Children learned where puddles formed after rain and where they did not. People adapted, as they always do. Occasionally he heard stories of meetings held behind closed doors, of budgets stretched thin to correct mistakes, of lessons learned the hard way. He did not follow these stories closely. They were no longer his burden. What mattered to him was that the land had been respected again. On a cool morning, months later, he walked farther than usual, beyond familiar paths, toward a quiet stretch of open ground that had remained untouched. He sat there for a long time, listening to nothing but wind and water. He thought about how icily this place could have been lost. Not taken in a dramatic way, but quietly, piece by piece. Under the weight of assumptions and approvals, he realized then that standing up for something did not always look heroic. Sometimes it looked boring. Sometimes it looked like paperwork, patience, saying the same calm thing over and over until someone finally listened. That understanding stayed with him. Later that year, a new project was proposed nearby. Smaller this time. Slower. Public meetings were held early. Questions were encouraged. Environmental reviews were taken seriously. He attended one meeting quietly, sitting in the back. When someone asked about water flow, the room listened. That more than anything told him the experience had mattered. He did not speak. He did not need to. The land spoke for itself. Now, on his final visit before winter, he walked the dam one last time, checking it out of habit more than necessity. Everything was in order. He rested his hand on the cool surface and looked out over the land. The creek moved steadily below, reflecting pale sky and bare branches. The air was clean. Still, he turned and walked away slowly. Not because he was leaving something behind, but because he knew it would be there when he returned. Some boundaries once defended do not need defending again. They simply stand, and that was enough.